In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a retired colonel is found stabbed, his secrets buried in burned letters. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, and her uncanny tabby, Tiberius, whose clues, a locket, a lavender scent, glove unravel a scandalous past of love and betrayal. As alibis crumble and hidden truths surface, Miss Marple and Tiberius expose a murderer, proving that in a quiet village, no secret escapes a cat's watchful gaze. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village Inn, the drowsy hamlet of St. Mary Mead, where time seemed to dawdle like a guest reluctant to leave. The autumn of 1929 cast a golden haze over stone cottages draped in ivy and honeysuckle. The village, nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, was a place where the rhythm of life pulsed, softly marked by the clink of teacups in Mrs. Price's tea room, the tolling of the church bell, and the rustle of leaves along the winding lanes. To an outsider, St. Mary Mead might appear as a mere speck on the map, unremarkable save for its quaint charm. But to Miss Jane Marple, who sat in her drawing room at Dame Mead Cottage, knitting a delicate shawl of pale blue wool, it was a microcosm of human nature, where every glance, every whisper, held the potential for revelation. Miss Marple's parlour was a study in quiet elegance. The chintz curtains, embroidered with roses, filtered the late afternoon sunlight into soft patterns on the polished oak floor. A small fire crackled in the grate, warding off the October chill, and on the mahogany table beside her rested a cup of Darjeeling, its steam curling upward like a question mark. Her knitting needles clicked in a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. She was a slight figure, with white hair neatly pinned, and eyes that sparkled with a curiosity undimmed by age. To the villagers, she was a kindly spinster, fond of gardening and gossip, but those who knew her better few, though they were recognized. A mind as sharp as the needles in her hands, capable of unraveling the most tangled skeins of human behavior. On the windowsill, basking in a pool of sunlight, lay Tiberius, her tabby cat. His fur was a patchwork of amber and black, and his eyes, half closed in feline contentment, missed nothing. Tiberius was no ordinary cat. Where other felines might chase sparrows or nap through the day, Tiberius had a knack for appearing at the precise moment something of interest occurred. Miss Marple often remarked to her nephew, Raymond West, that Tiberius was her finest observer, a sentiment Raymond dismissed with a laugh, calling it Aunt Jane's fancy. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen Tiberius pause by a gate where a quarrel had just taken place, or sniff at a patch of earth where a clue lay hidden. Today, as he stretched languorously, his tail flicked once, as if sensing a disturbance. In the village's tranquil air, St. Mary Mead was not without its dramas, though they were often small. A feud over a prize marrow at the village fete, a whispered rumour about the vicar's new curate, or the curious absence of Mrs. Bantry's best silver teapot after a WI meeting. But recently, a new ripple had stirred the village's calm surface. Willow Cottage, a charming dwelling at the edge of the village, had been let to a newcomer, retired colonel named Reginald Hawthorne. The colonel was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, with a bristling mustache and a manner that suggested he was more accustomed to barking orders than exchanging pleasantries. He had arrived 3 weeks prior, with little fanfare and fewer possessions, a battered trunk, a collection of military books, and a single manservant who doubled as a cook. The villagers, eager for novelty, had hoped for more a wife, perhaps, or a gaggle of grandchildren to liven the cottage. But Colonel Hawthorne kept to himself, rarely venturing beyond his garden gate except for a daily walk to the post office, where he collected a single letter each morning, always in the same cream envelope with a London postmark. Miss Marple had observed him on these walks, noting the stiffness in his gait, as if an old wound troubled him, and the way his eyes scanned the lane, not with curiosity but with wariness. She had mentioned him to her friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who lived at Gossington Hall and was a font of village gossip. "He's a queer sort," Dolly had said over tea, her eyes gleaming with intrigue. "They say he was in India, or perhaps Africa, and made a fortune in some shady way. Mrs. Price swears he keeps a revolver in his desk." Miss Marple had smiled at this, knowing Mrs. Price's tendency to embellish, but she filed the information away, as she did all such tidbits, like beads to be strung later into a pattern. The Colonel's arrival had coincided with other changes in St. Mary Mead. A glamorous widow, Mrs. Celia Trent, had taken up residence at Rose Hall, a Georgian manor on the village's outskirts. Mrs. Trent was a striking woman in her early 40s, with auburn hair and a wardrobe that spoke of London salons rather than rural tea rooms. She was accompanied by a man introduced as her brother, Mr. Lawrence Vale, though the villagers noted little resemblance between them. Lawrence was lean and sharp-featured, with a habit of sketching in the churchyard or by the river, his pencil moving swiftly over a notebook he never showed to anyone. The pair had charmed the village, at least Mrs. Trent had, with her warm smile and generous contributions to the Church Roof Fund. Lawrence, by contrast, was reserved, his silences making him an enigma. Miss Marple had met them at a garden party hosted by Mrs. Bantry, where Mrs. Trent had spoken of her late husband, a diplomat, and her love for travel, while Lawrence had stood apart, watching the crowd with an intensity Miss Marple found unsettling. On this particular afternoon, as Miss Marple's needles clicked and Tiberius dozed, the village seemed to hum with its usual rhythm. The postman cycled past, whistling a tune. Children laughed in the lane, returning from school, and yet there was a faint discord, like a wrong note in a familiar melody. Miss Marple paused her knitting, her fingers resting on the wool. She had learned to trust these moments of unease, these subtle shifts in the air that others might dismiss. Tiberius, too, seemed to sense it. His ears twitched, and he rose, stretching his lithe body before leaping from the sill and slipping through the open window into the garden. Miss Marple followed him with her eyes, noting how he moved with purpose, his tail low and his steps silent. The garden was her pride, a patchwork of roses, lavender, and hollyhocks, bordered by a low stone wall. Beyond it lay the lane that led to Willow Cottage, its chimneys just visible through the trees. She considered calling Tiberius back, but decided against it. He would return when he was ready, perhaps with a clue caught in his whiskers. Instead, she picked up her tea and sipped, her mind turning to the Colonel. She had seen him that morning, striding past her gate with his usual briskness, but there had been something different. Tightness in his jaw, a glance over his shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. She wondered about the cream envelopes, their regularity suggesting a correspondence of importance. A debt, perhaps, a threat, or simply an old friend, as Mrs. Bantry had suggested, though Dolly's romantic notions were often more hopeful than accurate. The village clock struck 4, its chimes drifting over the rooftops. Miss Marple set down her cup and resumed her knitting, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a conversation with the vicar, Mr. Clement, who had mentioned the Colonel's interest in the church's military memorials. He stood for a long time by the plaque for Captain Harrow, Mr. Clement had said, his mild face puzzled. Asked if I knew the family. I told him they'd left the village years ago. Miss Marple had nodded, but her mind had snagged on the name. Harrow. It was familiar, though she couldn't place it. A family from her youth, perhaps, or a name from one of Raymond's stories. She made a mental note to ask Mrs. Bantry, whose memory for village history was encyclopedic, if occasionally embellished, as the light faded, casting long shadows across the parlour. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Lucy, her young maid, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," she said, "but Mrs. Bantry sent a note. Says it's urgent." Miss Marple took the folded paper, her fingers steady despite the quickening of her pulse. Dolly's handwriting was bold and hurried. "Jane, come to Gossington at once. Something dreadful at Willow Cottage. The Colonel, do hurry." The note ended abruptly, as if Dolly had been too agitated to finish. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping to the floor. She called for her coat and hat, her movements calm but swift. Tiberius, as if summoned, reappeared at the window, his eyes gleaming in the dusk. There was a smudge on his paw, dark and sticky, and Miss Marple's heart sank. Blood, she was certain, though whether animal or human she could not yet say. She stepped into the lane, her breath visible in the cool air. The village was quiet now, the children gone, the postman's whistle silenced. Only the rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog broke the stillness. As she walked toward Gossington Hall, her mind raced, piecing together fragments. The Colonel's wariness, the cream envelopes, Mrs. Trent's charm, Lawrence's sketches, and now Tiberius's bloodied paw. St. Mary Mead, she knew, was no stranger to secrets. She had seen them unravel before lovers' quarrels, hidden debts, betrayals cloaked in smiles. But this felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her face pale beneath her rouge. "Oh, Jane," she said, clutching Miss Marple's arm, "it's awful. Colonel Hawthorne dead. Found in his study, stabbed, they say. Constable Polk's there. Now, making a mess of things, no doubt." Miss Marple listened, her face composed, but her mind was already at work. She asked a few questions. Where was the body found? Who had been at the cottage? What time was it discovered? Dolly's answers were scattered but useful. The Colonel had been found at 8 that evening by his housekeeper, Mrs. Baines. The study window was open, papers strewn about. No one had seen a stranger in the village. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to Tiberius, who had followed her and now sat by the gate, licking his paw. The blood was gone, but the image lingered. In her mind, she declined Dolly's offer to stay, insisting she must see Willow Cottage herself. "But Jane, it's dark, and surely there's nothing you can do," Dolly protested. Miss Marple smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that belied the steel beneath. "I shan't interfere, Dolly, but I must observe. Things are often clearer in the quiet." With a lantern from Gossington's Hall, she set out, Tiberius padding silently beside her. The lane to Willow Cottage was narrow, bordered by hedgerows that seemed to whisper as she passed. The cottage itself was dark, save for a single light. In the study window, where Constable Polk's silhouette moved clumsily, no doubt trampling any clues, Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, her eyes taking in the scene, the neatly trimmed lawn, the rose bushes still blooming despite the season, the path leading to the open window. Tiberius darted forward, his tail twitching, and stopped at a spot near the window, sniffing intently. Miss Marple approached, her lantern casting a soft glow. There, in the earth, was a faint marker footprint, perhaps, though too smudged to be certain. She bent closer, her knees protesting, and saw something glint in the soil, a pearl, small and lustrous, as if from an earring. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind already turning to Mrs. Trent, who had worn pearls at the garden party, but none today inside. Constable Pock was indeed making a mess, his boots tracking mud across the study floor. The colonel lay slumped in his chair, a letter opener protruding from his chest, his face frozen. In a grimace of surprise, papers were scattered on the desk, but Miss Marple noted their orderly chaos. Someone had searched, but not haphazardly. Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper, hovered in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed. "I heard a cry, miss," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought it was a fox, but then I found him." Miss Marple nodded, her questions gentle but precise. Had the colonel had visitors? Did he seem troubled? Mrs. Baines mentioned a man he'd expected, an old comrade, but she'd been in her room and heard nothing else. Miss Marple thanked her, her eyes lingering on the woman's hands, which clutched a handkerchief scented faintly with lavender, scent she recalled from Mrs. Trent's presence. As she left the cottage, Tiberius at her heels, Miss Marple felt the weight of the pearl in her pocket and the puzzle in her mind. The colonel's death was no random act, she was certain. There was a pattern here, woven from old grudges, hidden truths, and perhaps a love turned sour. She thought of Mrs. Trent's smile, Lawrence's sketches, the cream envelopes, and Tiberius' uncanny instincts. St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet, was a stage, and the players were only beginning to reveal themselves. She returned to Danemead Cottage, her knitting waiting, but sleep would not come easily tonight. The village, she knew, held its secrets close, but with Tiberius's help and her own patient observation, she would unravel them one thread at a time. Chapter 2. The Fatal Evening. The evening of Colonel Reginald Hawthorne's death settled over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm, the kind that cloaks secrets in shadows and muffles whispers in the rustle of autumn leaves. The village, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something irrevocable had occurred within the stone walls of Willow Cottage. Miss Jane Marple, returning from Gossington Hall with her lantern casting, a feeble circle of light, felt the weight of that knowledge. The pearl in her pocket, the smudge on Tiberius's paw, and the image of the colonel's lifeless form haunted her thoughts. Each a piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to assemble. Her mind, as sharp as the knitting needles now tucked into her bag, turned over the details, seeking the thread that would bind them together. Danemead Cottage welcomed her with its familiar comforts, the faint creak of the floorboards, the lingering scent of lavender from her garden, and the soft glow of the fire she had left burning low. Tiberius, who had padded silently beside her, leaped onto the windowsill, his amber eyes reflecting the flames. He licked his paw once more, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the dark stain she had seen earlier. Blood, she was certain, though its source remained a mystery. She settled into her armchair, not to knit but to think, her hands folded in her lap as she replayed the evening's events. The cry Mrs. Baines had heard, the open window, the scattered papers, all pointed to a moment of violence, sudden and deliberate. But it was Tiberius's behavior that nagged at her, his purposeful darting to the window at Willow Cottage, his pause by the smudged earth. Cats, she mused, were not sentimental creatures. They acted with intent, and Tiberius's intent had been to show her something. The village clock struck 9, its chimes carrying through the still night. Miss Marple rose, lighting a second lamp to dispel the gathering dark. She drew the curtains aside, peering into the garden where the last roses clung stubbornly to their stems. The lane beyond was empty, save for the faint silhouette of a figure hurrying toward the village center. A man, perhaps, though the distance and dusk obscured his features. She made a mental note to ask Lucy, her maid, if anyone had been seen near Willow Cottage earlier. Lucy, though prone to flights of fancy, had a keen eye for the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead's residents. Her thoughts returned to the Colonel. Reginald Hawthorne had been a man of habit, his daily walks to the post office as precise as a military drill. The cream envelopes, always from London, suggested a correspondence of significance, perhaps a legal matter, or a debt, or something more personal. Miss Marple recalled the stiffness in his gait, the wary glance over his shoulder. He had been expecting trouble, she suspected, and trouble had found him. The letter opener, an unlikely weapon, spoke of improvisation, a crime, not planned but seized in a moment of passion. Yet the scattered papers suggested a search, methodical despite its appearance. Someone had wanted something. The Colonel possessed information, perhaps, or an object small enough to be concealed. Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by a soft thump as Tiberius leaped from the sill and padded to the door, his tail twitching. She opened it, letting him slip into the night, and followed him with her eyes as he vanished into the shadows of the garden. He would return, she knew, as he always did, perhaps with another clue caught in his claws. She turned back to her parlour, her gaze falling on the small table where she kept her correspondence. Among the letters was an invitation to tea at Rose Hall, sent by Mrs. Celia Trent. The widow's elegant script and the faint scent of her perfume on the paper had struck Miss Marple as deliberate, a performance of charm that masked something deeper. She resolved to accept the invitation, not only to observe Mrs. Trent and her enigmatic companion, Lawrence Vale, but to gauge their reactions to the Colonel's death. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the village stirring with the news of the tragedy. By the time Miss Marple stepped into the lane, her hat pinned neatly and her coat buttoned against the chill, St. Mary Mead was alive with whispers. At the post office, Mrs. Price, whose tea room doubled as the village's gossip hub, was holding court. "A burglary, that's what Constable Pox says," she declared to a cluster of women, her voice carrying over the clink of coins. "Smashed the window and took his valuables, poor man." Miss Marple, pausing to collect her mail, smiled politely but said nothing. A burglary seemed unlikely. The Colonel's Spartan furnishings suggested little worth stealing, and the letter opener was hardly the weapon of a thief caught in the act. She continued to the church, where Mr. Clement was polishing the brass lectern, his face clouded with concern. "A terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, setting down his cloth. "Poor Hawthorne. He seemed a solitary soul, but not one to make enemies." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the military memorials. Along the wall, the plaque for Captain Harrow caught her attention again, its inscription worn but legible. She asked Mr. Clement about the Harrow family, and he repeated his earlier remark. They had left St. Mary Mead decades ago, after a scandal no one quite remembered. The Colonel asked about them too, he added, frowning. Seemed quite keen to know if any relations remained. Miss Marple filed this away, sensing a connection, however faint, to the cream envelopes or the Colonel's past. Her next stop was the village shop, where she purchased a tin of biscuits and lingered to eavesdrop. The shopkeeper, Mr. Tuttle, was recounting the discovery of the body to a customer. Mrs. Baines found him, screaming fit to wake the dead, he said, shaking his head. Says she heard a cry around 7, thought it was a fox, but went to check, and there he was, stone dead. Miss Marple noted the time 7 o'clock, when the village was settling into its evening routines. She asked casually if Mrs. Baines had mentioned visitors, and Mr. Tuttle shrugged. Just that old comrade the Colonel was expecting. Never saw him myself. Returning to Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple found Tiberius waiting on the doorstep, a scrap of fabric caught in his claws. It was fine silk, pale green, and bore a faint stain, mud, perhaps, or something darker. She examined it closely, noting its texture and the subtle scent of lavender clinging to it. It reminded her of the handkerchief Mrs. Baines had clutched, though the scent also evoked Mrs. Trent's presence at the garden party. She tucked the fabric into an envelope, labeling it carefully, and placed it beside the pearl from the cottage garden. Tiberius, watching her, gave a low meow, as if approving her diligence. That afternoon, she walked to Rose Hall for Mrs. Trent's tea, Tiberius trailing at a discreet distance. The manor was a vision of elegance, its lawns manicured and its windows gleaming. Mrs. Trent greeted her with warmth, her auburn hair catching the light as she poured tea from a silver pot. Lawrence Vale was present, though he said little, his eyes fixed on a sketchbook he closed as Miss Marple entered. The conversation was light village matters, the weather, but Miss Marple steered it gently toward the Colonel. Such a shock, she said, her voice mild. Did you know him well? Mrs. Trent's smile faltered, and Lawrence's pencil paused mid-air. Barely, Mrs. Trent said, recovering quickly. We met once, at the fete. He seemed reserved. Lawrence added nothing, but his gaze lingered on Tiberius, who had slipped into the room and was sniffing at a vase of roses. Miss Marple noted the absence of pearls at Mrs. Trent's ears, though a single strand adorned her neck. She mentioned the Colonel's military past, watching their reactions. Mrs. Trent changed the subject, and Lawrence excused himself, claiming a headache. As Miss Marple left, she glimpsed him in the garden, tearing a page from his sketchbook and tossing it into a brazier. Tiberius, unnoticed, darted toward the flames, but Miss Marple called him back. She would return later, she decided, when the household was less guarded. Back at Danemead, she sat by the fire, the silk scrap and pearl before her. The cry at 7, the open window, the letter opener, the searched papers, and now Tiberius's finds-all pointed to a crime rooted in the past, perhaps tied to the Colonel's time in India or the mysterious Harrow family. She thought of Mrs. Trent's charm, Lawrence's silences, and Mrs. Baines's trembling hands. The village, with its quiet lanes and smiling faces, was a tapestry of secrets, and Miss Marple knew that unraveling it would require patience, observation, and perhaps another clue from Tiberius. As the clock struck 10, she rose to make tea, her mind already weaving the next steps in her quiet pursuit of the truth. Chapter 3. The Housekeeper's Tale. The morning after Colonel Reginald Hawthorne's death draped St. Mary Mead in a shroud of grey clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain and the weight of unspoken questions. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of village life, stood in her garden at Danemead Cottage, her small shears snipping at faded rose petals with a precision that mirrored her thoughts. The events of the previous evening, the cry, the open window, the blood on Tiberius's paw, the pearl in the cottage garden, and the silk scrap scented with lavender formed a tapestry of clues, each thread begging to be woven into a coherent pattern. Tiberius, her tabby companion, was absent, likely stalking the lanes of St. Mary Mead in pursuit of secrets only a cat could uncover. Miss Marple, trusting his uncanny instincts, decided to visit Willow Cottage under the guise of offering condolences to the housekeeper, Mrs. Baines, but with the true intent of probing the shadows cast by the Colonel's murder. The lane to Willow Cottage was hushed, the gravel crunching softly under her sensible shoes, the only sound save for the distant caw of a rook circling above the elms. The cottage, with its low eaves and climbing roses, stood deceptively tranquil, its stone walls guarding the violence within. A young constable, barely more than a boy, stood at the gate, his nod to Miss Marple stiff with inexperience. She carried a basket of homemade damson preserves, a pretext as delicate as the lace at her collar, and knocked gently on the door. Mrs. Baines answered, her face pale as parchment, her eyes darting like a cornered hare's. "Miss Marple, how kind," she murmured, her voice fraying at the edges, and ushered her into the kitchen. The kitchen was a study in order, pots aligned on hooks, cloths folded with care, a kettle simmering on the stove. Yet the air was taut, as if the cottage held its breath, wary of what Miss Marple's sharp eyes might uncover. Mrs. Baines offered tea, her hands trembling as she set out cups that clashed in their patterns, a sign of her disarray. "I'm all to pieces," she confessed, sinking into a chair, her fingers clutching a lavender-scented handkerchief. To think of the Colonel, gone like that. Miss Marple offered murmurs of sympathy, her gaze noting the housekeeper's plain grey dress, the frayed apron, and the lavender scent that echoed the silk scrap Tiberius had brought her. It was a scent too distinct to be chance, and she tucked the observation away, her face as serene as the village green. Over weak tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the fatal evening. "A dreadful shock," she said, her voice soft as a whisper in church, yet edged with purpose. "You mentioned a cry, I believe." Mrs. Baines nodded, her fingers twisting her apron's hem. "Near 7 o'clock, it was I. Took it for a fox, there's one bin at the hen's butt." Then came a thump, like a sack of flour dropped. I went to the study, and oh, miss, there he was, that letter opener in his chest. Her voice cracked, and she pressed the handkerchief to her eyes. Miss Marple noted the lavender scent again, its persistence tugging at her mind like a loose stitch. "Did the Colonel have visitors?" "Often?" Miss Marple asked, sipping the tepid tea, her eyes gentle but unyielding. Mrs. Baines hesitated, glancing at the window as if expecting a shadow to move. "Not many," she said finally. "He was a solitary sort, but he was waiting for someone. That night an old comrade," he said, "due after 6. I didn't see who, though I was upstairs, mending." Her words were measured, almost too careful, and Miss Marple sensed a veil drawn over the truth. She pressed lightly, asking if the Colonel had seemed troubled. "He was restless," Mrs. Baines admitted, pacing, checking his watch. "Those letters from London, they fretted him. Burned them all, he did, in the study fire." The mention of the cream envelopes quickened Miss Marple's pulse. "Letters," she said, her tone idly curious. "Every day, the same," Mrs. Baines said. "Cream paper, London postmark. He'd read them, then burned them. Never said why." This detail, new and sharp, settled in Miss Marple's mind like a pebble in a stream. The scattered papers on the Colonel's desk, the open window, the letter opener. Someone had sought something, perhaps within those letters. She shifted the conversation to the window. "Strange, it being open," Mrs. Baines said, frowning. He always locked it on account of his papers, but it was wide open when I found him. A soft patter at the door announced Tiberius, his tail high, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Baines. He crossed the kitchen with purpose, pausing to sniff a rug by the table. Miss Marple followed his gaze, noting a faint stain on the rug's edgemud, or perhaps blood. She rose, feigning interest in the cottage's charm, and knelt to inspect the stain, her fingers brushing its crusty texture. It was not mud, she suspected, but she kept her counsel, commenting on the rug's weave to distract. Mrs. Baines, as she straightened, a glint caught her Arger pearl earring beneath the table, twin to the one from the garden. She palmed it swiftly, her heart quickening. 2 pearls, both near the crime, whispered of haste or carelessness, and her thoughts turned to Mrs. Celia Trent, whose elegance was as calculated as a chess move. Mrs. Baines, unaware of the find, spoke on, her words tumbling like spilled beads. She described the Colonel's routines, his dawn walks, his solitary suppers, his need for solitude. Only Mr. Vale came by, about a week ago, she said. They spoke in the study, voices hushed. I caught something about old debts and no quarter given. Didn't linger to hear more. Miss Marple's mind snagged on Lawrence. Vale, Mrs. Trent's supposed brother, whose visit suggested a tie to the Colonel, perhaps one of resentment or obligation. She asked if Mrs. Trent had called, and Mrs. Baines shook her head. Not her. She's too grand for the likes of us. The denial was quick, but Miss Marple noted the housekeeper's flushed cheeks as the tea cooled. Miss Marple's thoughts wove a pattern. The cry at 7, the searched desk, the burned letters, and now the second pearl earring. She thanked Mrs. Baines, her manner as gentle as ever, and stepped into the lane, Tiberius at her heels. The clouds had thickened, and a fine drizzle began to fall, misting her coat. She walked to the village shop, where Mr. Tuttle was recounting the murder to a cluster of customers. Mrs. Baines found him, screaming like a banshee, he said, shaking his head. Heard the cry at 7, thought it a fox, but found him dead. Miss Marple lingered, buying a tin of biscuits, and asked if Mrs. Baines had mentioned visitors. Just that, comrade, the Colonel expected, Mr. Tuttle said. No one saw him come or go. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple placed the earring beside the pearl and silk scrap, her parlour a quiet haven for her thoughts. She sat by the fire, Tiberius curling at her feet, and considered the housekeeper's tale. Mrs. Baines's nerves, the lavender scent, the stained rug, and the earring, suggested she knew more than she let on. The Colonel's letters, burned to ash, hinted at a past that had followed him to St. Mary Mead. Lawrence Vale's visit, with talk of debts, pointed to a grudge, and Mrs. Trent's missing pearls raised questions of her own. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to Tiberius, whose instincts had led her to each clue. The village, with its quiet lanes and polite smiles, was a stage for secrets, and she knew that with patience and her cat's subtle guidance, she would unravel the truth, one delicate thread at a time. Chapter 4. The widow and the brother. The drizzle that had begun the previous morning had settled into a persistent rain by the afternoon, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a mist that softened the edges of its stone cottages and blurred the outlines of its secrets. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, adjusted her hat and set out for Rose Hall, the elegant Georgian manor where Mrs. Celia Trent and her enigmatic companion, Mr. Lawrence Vale, resided. The invitation to tea, penned in Mrs. Trent's florid script, had arrived days before Colonel Hawthorne's death. and Miss Marple saw it as an opportunity not only to observe the widow and her supposed brother, but to gauge their reactions to the tragedy that had shaken the village. Tiberius, her tabby cat, followed at a discreet distance, his paws silent on the wet gravel, his amber eyes alert to the world's subtleties. Rose Hall stood at the end of a curving drive, its honeycomb stone glowing faintly through the mist. The gardens, though sodden, were meticulously tended, with late-blooming asters and chrysanthemums defying the autumn chill. Miss Marple noted the air of prosperity, the polished brass knocker, the gleaming windows, the faint scent of beeswax. From within Naz, she was ushered into the drawing-room by a maid whose deference bordered on nervousness. The room was a study in refinement, silk drapes in pale gold, a Persian rug underfoot, and a silver tea service that gleamed on a rosewood table. Mrs. Trent rose to greet her, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her smile warm but practiced. "Miss Marple, how delightful," she said, her voice smooth as the silk of her dress. "I do hope the rain hasn't troubled you." Mr. Lawrence Vale was present, seated by a window with a sketchbook on his lap, his lean frame tense despite his casual posture. His eyes, sharp and grey, flicked to Miss Marple, and then to Tiberius, who had slipped into the room and was sniffing at a vase of roses. "My brother," Mrs. Trent said, gesturing to Lawrence with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "He's rather shy, I'm afraid." Lawrence nodded, his greeting curt, and returned to his sketching, though Miss Marple noted the tightness of his grip on the pencil. She settled into a chair, her basket of preserves placed discreetly at her feet, and accepted a cup of Earl Grey, its bergamot aroma mingling with the faint lavender scent she had come to associate with both Mrs. Baines and the silk scrap. The conversation began with village pleasantries, the church roof fund, the upcoming harvest supper, but Miss Marple, with the gentle persistence of a gardener teasing roots from soil, steered it toward Colonel Hawthorne. "Such a dreadful business at Willow Cottage," she said, her tone one of mild regret. "Did you know the Colonel well?" Mrs. Trent's hand paused as she reached for a scone, her fingers brushing her neck where a single strand of pearls gleamed. "Hardly at all," she said, her voice steady but her eyes flickering. "We met at the fete, briefly. He seemed distant." Lawrence's pencil stopped, and he glanced at his sister, a look so fleeting Miss Marple nearly missed. A military man, wasn't he?" she pressed, her voice as soft as the rain outside. "I believe he served in India." Mrs. Trent nodded, her smile tightening. "So I heard. Lawrence, didn't you meet him once?" Lawrence's gaze returned to his sketchbook, his fingers resuming their work. "Once," he said, his voice clipped. "At the cottage. Talked about the weather." The lie was subtle, but Miss Marple caught the hesitation, the way his eyes avoided hers. Mrs. Baines had mentioned Lawrence's visit, with talk of old debts and no quarter given. Whatever had passed between him and the Colonel was more than a discussion of rain or crops. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the absence of earrings on Mrs. Trent's ears, though the pearl necklace suggested a fondness for such adornments. The 2 pearl earrings, one from the cottage garden, one from Mrs. Baines's kitchen, burned in her memory, their antique design hinting at a gift, perhaps from a suitor long ago. She changed tack, mentioning the villagers' shock at the murder. "Constable Pauck thinks it a burglary," she said, watching their faces. Mrs. Trent's laugh was light, almost musical. "A burglar in St. Mary Mead? How absurd." Lawrence said nothing, but his pencil scratched harder, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Tiberius, who had been prowling the edges of the room, leapt onto a side table, knocking a small crystal figurine to the floor. It did not break, but Mrs. Trent's reaction was swift, her hand flying to her chest as she rose. "Oh, that naughty cat," she exclaimed, though her tone was more strained than playful. Miss Marple apologized, calling Tiberius to her side, but not before noticing his interest in a folded shawl on the tabula shawl of pale green silk, its hue matching the scrap he had brought her. The lavender scent was faint but unmistakable, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She made a mental note to examine the brazier in the garden, where she had seen Lawrence burn a page the previous day. The conversation turned to Mrs. Trent's past, prompted by Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about her late husband, the diplomat. "He was a dear man," Mrs. Trent said, her eyes softening, though Miss Marple sensed a performance. "We travelled so much, Paris, Vienna, Constantinople. I do miss it." She touched her pearls again, her fingers lingering, and Miss Marple wondered if they were a memento of that life or of another. Lawrence, silent until now, excused himself, claiming a need to finish his sketch. His departure was abrupt, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of his sketchbook as he closed eat a rough drawing of a man's face, stern and mustached, bearing a striking resemblance to Colonel Hawthorne. As the tea drew to a close, Mrs. Trent grew more animated, inviting Miss Marple to the next village event, her charm a polished shield. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the shawl, now draped carelessly over the table's edge, and to Tiberius, who sat by the window, staring at the garden where the brazier stood. She thanked her hostess, her manner as mild as ever, and stepped into the rain, Tiberius following. The drive back to the lane was slick with mud, and Miss Marple paused by the brazier, now cold and wet. A fragment of burned paper clung to its edge, the ink smudged but legible. "No forgiveness." The words echoed Mrs. Baines's account of Lawrence's visit, and Miss Marple slipped the fragment into her pocket, her mind weaving connections. At Danemead Cottage, she laid out her clues: 2 pearl earrings, a silk scrap, a burned paper fragment, and the persistent lavender scent. She sat by the fire, Tiberius purring at her feet, and considered the widow and her brother. Mrs. Trent's charm was a veneer, hiding a past that might link to the Colonel's. Lawrence's silences and sketches suggested a deeper involvement, perhaps resentment or guilt. The pearls, the shawl, and the burned paper pointed to a moment of haste on the fatal evening, and Miss Marple suspected that Rose Hall held more secrets than its gracious facade revealed. She resolved to visit the vicar, Mr. Clement, whose wife, Griselda, was a friend of Mrs. Trent's, and might let slip a detail about her past. As the rain drummed on the roof, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Colonel's burned letters, the open window, and Tiberius's unerring instincts. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting for her to unravel it with the patience of a knitter untangling a knot. Chapter 5. Tiberius's clue. The rain that had draped St. Mary Mead in a silver veil through the afternoon had eased by evening, leaving the village glistening under a hesitant moon. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour at Danemead Cottage, the fire casting flickering shadows across the chintz curtains and the polished oak floor. Her knitting lay untouched in its basket, for her mind was too occupied with the threads of Colonel Hawthorne's murder to focus on Wall. The 2 pearl earrings, the silk scrap scented with lavender, and the burned paper fragment with its ominous words, "No forgiveness," lay on the table before her, each a silent witness to the events at Willow Cottage. But it was Tiberius, her tabby cat, who held her attention now. He had returned from his nocturnal wanderings just as she settled by the fire, his amber eyes gleaming with purpose. A new offering caught in his claws, a small, tarnished silver locket, its chain broken and its surface scratched as if it had been trampled in haste. Miss Marple lifted the locket carefully, noting its weight and the faint engraving on its back, a monogram, CT, entwined in a delicate script. She pressed the clasp, and the locket sprang open, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman with auburn hair, her smile strikingly similar to Mrs. Celia Trent's. The other half held a lock of dark hair, tied with a thread of silk that lavender scent, faint but unmistakable, clung to the locket, linking it to the silk scrap and the shawl at Rose Hall. Tiberius, perched on the arm of her chair, watched her with an air of quiet satisfaction, as if he had delivered the key to the puzzle. Miss Marple stroked his head, murmuring, "You've outdone yourself, Tiberius," her mind already racing to connect this new clue to the web of secrets surrounding the Colonel's death. The roses, the open window, and the letter opener that had ended Colonel Hawthorne's life. The locket, she suspected, had been dropped in a moment of flight, perhaps by someone fleeing through the garden. Its monogram and photograph pointed to Mrs. Trent, but the presence of the dark hair possibly belonging to Lawrence Vale or another, a deeper story, one of love, betrayal, or obligation. Miss Marple resolved to visit the vicarage the next morning. For Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, was a friend of Mrs. Trent's, and might offer insight into her past. But first, she needed to confirm the locket's origins. She recalled Mrs. Trent's touch to her bare ear during tea, a gesture that now seemed laden with meaning, given the absence of her usual pearl earrings. The locket, with its intimate contents, suggested a connection to the Colonel that went beyond casual acquaintance, a connection that might explain the tension she had observed in Lawrence Vale's demeanor. The next morning, the village awoke to a sky washed clean by the rain, the air crisp with the scent of wet leaves and woods. Miss Marple, her hat pinned neatly and her coat buttoned against the chill, walked to the vicarage, Tiberius trailing behind, his tail flicking like a metronome. The vicarage was a rambling house, its garden a riot of late dahlias and daisies. Griselda greeted her with a warmth that bordered on exuberance, her youthful energy a contrast to Mr. Clement's quiet reserve. Over tea in the sunny parlour, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Mrs. Trent, mentioning the Colonel's death in passing. "Such a shock," she said, her voice gentle. "I believe Mrs. Trent met him at the fete." Griselda, ever eager to share gossip, leaned forward. "Oh, Celia was quite taken with him, in her way. Said he reminded her of someone from her youth, a soldier, I think. She didn't say much, but you know how she gets, all wistful." Miss Marple's heart quickened. A soldier from Mrs. Trent's youth could be the Colonel himself, or another, tied to the locket's photograph. She asked if Mrs. Trent had ever spoken of an engagement, and Griselda's eyes lit up. "Once, after too much sherry at the harvest supper. Said she was nearly married to a military man, years ago, in London. Broke it off when he found her with someone else. Quite the scandal," she said, though she laughed it off. This was a new thread, and Miss Marple tugged at it gently. "And Mr. Vale," she asked, "was he part of that time?" Griselda frowned, stirring her tea. "Lawrence, she doesn't talk about him much. Says he's her brother, but they don't act like siblings. More like, well, you know how people talk." Miss Marple did know. The village had speculated that Lawrence was no brother, but perhaps a cousin, a friend, or something closer. The locket's dark hair, the burned paper's words, and Lawrence's sketch of a man resembling the Colonel suggested a triangle love, jealousy, or revenge that had culminated in murder. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where Lawrence often sketched. He was there, seated on a bench, his pencil moving over a notebook. Tiberius, unnoticed, crept closer, his eyes fixed on a small pile of torn paper at Lawrence's feet sketches, perhaps discarded in haste. Miss Marple approached, her manner disarming. "A lovely spot for drawing," she said, peering at his work. The sketch was of the church, but its lines were unsteady, as if drawn by a distracted hand. Lawrence closed the book quickly, his smile thin. "Just passing the time," he said, but his eyes darted to Tiberius, who was sniffing the torn papers. Miss Marple stooped to retrieve one, feigning a stumble, and saw a partial sketch of a letter opener, its blade gleaming. She pocketed it, her heart racing, and made polite excuses to leave. Back at Danemead, she laid the locket beside her other clues: the pearls, the silk scrap, the burned paper. The locket's monogram and photograph confirmed a connection to Mrs. Trent, perhaps a gift from the Colonel or another from her past. The dark hair, the lavender scent, and Griselda's gossip suggested a broken engagement, a scandal that had followed Mrs. Trent to St. Mary Mead. Lawrence's sketch of the letter opener, his visit to the Colonel, and the words, "no forgiveness," pointed to a motive rooted in that past. Miss Marple sat by the fire, Tiberius purring at her feet, and felt the puzzle tightening. The Colonel's burned letters, the open window, and Tiberius's clues were guiding her toward a truth that lay hidden in the village's quiet lanes, waiting for her patient hand to unravel it. Chapter 6. The hidden past. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a fragile light across the village, where dew glistened on cobwebs and the air carried the sharp tang of autumn. Miss Jane Marple sat at her small writing desk in Danemead Cottage, her hands still, her mind weaving through the clues that had accumulated like leaves in a storm. To pearl earrings, a lavender-scented silk scrap, a burned paper fragment with the words "no forgiveness," and now the tarnished locket with its monogram CD and faded photograph of a young woman resembling Mrs. Celia Trent. Tiberius, her tabby cat, lounged on the windowsill, his amber eyes half closed but watchful, as if guarding the secrets he had helped uncover. The locket, with its lock of dark hair and subtle lavender scent, had deepened the mystery of Colonel Hawthorne's murder, pointing to a past that bound the Colonel, Mrs. Trent, and Lawrence Vale in a knot of old wounds and hidden truths. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Griselda's gossip about Mrs. Trent's broken engagement to a military man, a scandal that had left whispers in its wake. The locket's photograph, the Colonel's interest in the Harrow family, and Lawrence's sketch of a letter opener suggested a story of love, betrayal, and perhaps vengeance, played out in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. She resolved to dig deeper into this past, starting with the village's collective memory, which, though often embellished, held grains of truth. Her first stop would be the post office, where Mrs. Price, the proprietress of the tea room, presided over gossip as if it were her private domain. Miss Marple slipped the locket into her pocket, alongside the other clues, and set out, her steps measured but purposeful, Tiberius trailing behind like a silent partner. The post office was a hub of activity, its counter cluttered with parcels and letters, the air thick with the scent of ink and fresh bread from the bakery next door. Mrs. Price, her eyes bright with the thrill of calamity, was recounting the Colonel's murder to a cluster of villagers, her voice rising over the clink of coins. Stabbed Right in his study, she said, her hands gesturing dramatically. And those letters he got, burned to ash. Mark my words, there's a secret there. Miss Marple, selecting a few stamps, listened quietly, then asked, as if in passing, about the Harrow family, whose name had surfaced in the Colonel's inquiries. Mrs. Price's face lit up. Oh, the Harrows, left years ago, after a right-to-do. Young Clara Harrow, she was, ran off with a soldier, broke her engagement to another. Her father never got over it, died of a broken heart, they say. This was new, and Miss Marple's mind seized on it. Clara Harrow, a jilted engagement. A soldier. Could Clara be the young woman in the locket? And the soldier, Colonel Hawthorne? She pressed Mrs. Price for details, her tone mild but insistent. The soldier was a dashing sort. Name of Reginald something, Mrs. Price said, warming to her tale. But Clara was caught with another man, a writer or artist, I forget. The soldier called it off, and Clara left for London. Never came back. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The artist could be Lawrence Vale, or someone like him, and the scandal matched Griselda's account of Mrs. Trent's past. If Mrs. Trent was Clara Harrow, or connected to her, the locket and the Colonel's arrival in St. Mary Mead took on a new significance. Leaving the post office, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where the Harrow family's gravestones might offer further clues. The churchyard was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the soft cooing of doves. She found the Harrow plot, its stones weathered but legible. Clara's father, dead in 1905, and her mother, a year later. No mention of Clara herself, confirming she had left the village. Tiberius, who had followed, leaped onto a low wall, his eyes fixed on a patch of earth beneath a yew tree. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting, and saw a faint indentation, a small object, recently buried and unearthed. She brushed away the soil, revealing a single pearl button, its luster dulled but intact. It matched the style of Mrs. Trent's wardrobe, and Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket, her mind linking it to the earrings and the silk shawl. Her next stop was the village library, a modest room attached to the town hall, where old records and newspapers were kept. Miss Marple, with the librarian's reluctant permission, pored over yellowed clippings from the early 1900s, searching for mentions of Clara Harrow or Reginald Hawthorne. She found a brief notice of Clara's engagement to Captain R. Hawthorne, of the Indian Army, followed by a terse announcement of its dissolution, with no explanation. Another article, from a London paper, hinted at a scandal involving Clara and an artist named Lawrence Vane, whose sketches had caused a stir at a gallery exhibition. The similarity to Lawrence Vale's name was striking, and Miss Marple wondered if he had altered it to distance himself from that past. The Colonel's burned letters, she suspected, might have contained threats or demands tied to this old affair, stirring old resentments that led to his death. Returning to Daymead Cottage, Miss Marple found Tiberius waiting on the doorstep, a fresh offering at his feet, a small brass key, its surface scratched but functional. She examined it closely, noting its size too small for a door, perhaps for a box or desk. The Colonel's study, with its scattered papers, came to mind, and she resolved to ask Constable Polk to search for a locked box or drawer. She laid the key beside her other clues, each a piece of the puzzle: the pearls, the silk, the burned paper, the locket, and now the button and key. The lavender scent, persistent across the clues, tied them to Mrs. Trent. But Lawrence's sketch of the letter opener and his visit to the Colonel suggested he was no mere bystander. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, hoping her friend's encyclopedic knowledge of village lore might shed light on the Harrow scandal. Over scones in the sunny conservatory, Mrs. Bantry confirmed Mrs. Price's story, adding a detail: Clara Harrow was a beauty, auburn hair and all. They said she broke that soldier's heart, running off with the artist. Her family never recovered. Miss Marple asked if Clara had ever returned, and Mrs. Bantry shook her head. Not that I know, but Celia Trent reminds me of her, same hair, same charm. You don't think? She trailed off, her eyes wide, but Miss Marple only smiled. Her thoughts guarded. As she left Gossington, Tiberius darted ahead, pausing at a hedge near the lane. Miss Marple followed, finding a torn glove, fine leather, scented with lavender, its cuff embroidered with deceit. Her heart quickened. The glove, like the locket and shawl, pointed to Mrs. Trent, but its proximity to Willow Cottage suggested she had been near the scene of the crime. Miss Marple tucked it away, her mind weaving a pattern. Clara Harrow, jilted by Hawthorne, entangled with an artist, perhaps Lawrence under a different name. The Colonel's arrival in St. Mary Mead, his burned letters, and his death suggested a past that refused to stay buried. Lawrence's sketch and the no forgiveness fragment hinted at a motive, but Mrs. Trent's pearls and glove suggested her own involvement. Back at Danemead, Miss Marple sat by the fire, Tiberius purring at her feet. The cluse pearls, silk, locket, button, key, glove formed a constellation of evidence, each pointing to a love affair turned sour, a scandal that had followed its players to the village. She resolved to speak to Constable Pauck about the key and to watch Mrs. Trent and Lawrence closely at the next village gathering. The truth, she knew, was near, hidden in the quiet rhythms of St. Mary Mead, waiting for her and Tiberius to draw it into the light. Chapter 7. The alibi unravelled. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the wet cobblestones and softening the edges of a village still reeling from Colonel Hawthorne's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour at Danemead Cottage, her knitting needles idle in their basket, her mind threading through the clues that had accumulated like beads on a string. 2 pearl earrings, a lavender-scented silk scrap, a burned paper fragment bearing the words "No", forgiveness, a locket with Mrs. Trent's monogram, a pearl button, a brass key, and a leather glove embroidered with deceit. Each pointed to a tangled past involving Mrs. Celia Trent, Lawrence Vale, and the late Colonel, a past rooted in a broken engagement and a scandal that had resurfaced in the quiet lanes of the village. Tiberius, her tabby cat, sprawled across the hearthrug, his amber eyes glinting as if he, too, were pondering the puzzle. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the alibis of Mrs. Trent and Lawrence Vale, both of whom had been evasive during her visit to Rose Hall. Mrs. Trent claimed to have been at home all evening, while Lawrence said he was sketching by the river, a claim no one could confirm. The clues: Tiberius had uncovered the glove near Willow Cottage, the locket in the garden, the button in the churchyard, suggested one or both had been near the scene of the crime. The brass key, small enough for a box or drawer, nagged her. If it belonged to the Colonel's study, it might unlock a secret he had died to protect. She resolved to speak with Constable Pauck, whose earnest but clumsy investigation might benefit from a gentle nudge, and to revisit Willow Cottage to test her suspicions. The village was subdued as Miss Marple stepped into the lane, her coat buttoned against the evening chill. Tiberius followed, his tail low, his steps silent on the damp grass. At the post office, Mrs. Price was still spinning tales of the murder, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "A burglar," Polk says, "but I say it's personal. Those letters, the Colonel burned secrets. They were." Miss Marple, purchasing a postcard, asked casually if anyone had seen Mrs. Trent or Lawrence near Willow Cottage that evening. Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed. "Funny you ask. Old Mr. Giles, the gardener, swears he saw a woman in a green shawl near the cottage at dusk. Couldn't say who, mind, but it wasn't Mrs. Baines." This was a new thread, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. The green shawl matched the silk scrap and the shawl at Rose Hall, both scented with lavender. She thanked Mrs. Price and walked to the police cottage, where Constable Polk was sorting papers, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he said, rising awkwardly, "I'm doing my best, but it's a muddle." She smiled, her manner disarming, and mentioned the key, suggesting he search the Colonel's study for a locked box or drawer. "And the garden," she added gently. "There might be more to find near the window." Polk nodded, eager to please, and promised to look at Willow Cottage. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and recent tragedy. The young constable at the gate let her pass, and Mrs. Baines, still pale, admitted her to the study. The room was, as Miss Marple remembered, the desk strewn with papers, the letter opener gone for evidence, the window now closed but unlatched. Tiberius, slipping in behind her, darted to a corner near the fireplace, his nose twitching. Miss Marple followed, kneeling to find a small, locked box hidden behind a stack of books. The brass key fit perfectly, and inside she found a single letter, unburned, its cream envelope bearing a London postmark. She slipped it into her pocket, promising to share it with Polk, and noted Tiberius's interest in a rug near the window, where a faint scuff mark suggested a struggle. The letter, read later in the privacy of her parlour, was a revelation. Written in a precise hand, it demanded the Colonel return what was taken or face exposure. The signature was illegible, but the tone suggested an old grievance, perhaps tied to the Harrow scandal. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Price's story of Clara Harrow's jilted engagement to a soldier likely Hawthorne and her affair with an artist, possibly Lawrence Vale under another name. The letter's demand, the burned fragments, and the clues pointed to a confrontation that had ended in murder. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage, where Mrs. Trent and Lawrence were present. Griselda, ever the vivacious hostess, welcomed her warmly, but Miss Marple's eyes were on the pair from Rose Hall. Mrs. Trent wore a green silk dress, its hue matching the shawl and scrap, and no earrings, though her pearl necklace gleamed. Lawrence was silent, his sketchbook absent, his fingers tapping restlessly. Over sherry, Miss Marple mentioned the gardener's sighting of a woman near Willow Cottage. Watching their faces, Mrs. Trent's smile faltered, and Lawrence's hand stilled. "I was at home," Mrs. Trent said quickly. "All evening, reading." Lawrence nodded. "I was by the river, sketching." Their alibis, repeated too smoothly, rang false. Tiberius, who had slipped into the vicarage, leaped onto a table, knocking over a glass. In the confusion, Miss Marple saw Lawrence drop a handkerchief embroidered with LV and scented with lavender. She retrieved it discreetly, her mind racing. The handkerchief, the glove, the shawl all tied to Rose Hall, all scented. With lavender, she excused herself, citing the hour, and returned to Danemead, Tiberius at her heels. In her parlour, she laid out the clues: the letter, the handkerchief, the key, the button, the locket, the pearls, the silk. The alibis of Mrs. Trent and Lawrence were unravelling, their presence near Willow Cottage, confirmed by the gardener and Tiberius's finds. The letter's demands suggested a motive restitution or revenge for a past wrong. Perhaps Clara Harrow's disgrace. Miss Marple sat by the fire, Tiberius purring softly, and felt the puzzle tightening. The Colonel's death was no random act, but the culmination of a hidden past. Its roots in a scandal that had followed its players to St. Mary Mead. She resolved to press Poke to search the cottage garden again, for the scuff mark, and Tiberius's interest suggested more clues waited. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the village's quiet rhythms, and with Tiberius's uncanny guidance, she would draw it into the light. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill that seeped through the seams of Miss Jane Marple's coat as she walked to the vicarage. Her steps measured but resolute. The village, bathed in the soft glow of lanterns, and the faint shimmer of starlight, seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the unraveling of secrets that had festered since Colonel Hawthorne's murder. Miss Marple's parlour at Danemead Cottage had become a quiet archive of clues to pearl earrings, a lavender-scented silk scrap, a burned paper fragment with no forgiveness, a locket monogrammed CT pearl button, a brass key, a leather glove with CT, and a handkerchief embroidered LV. The unburned letter from the Colonel's locked box, demanding restitution for what was taken, had tightened the web around Mrs. Celia, Trent, and Lawrence Vale. Tiberius, her tabby cat, padded beside her, his amber eyes glinting with purpose, as if he too knew the moment of truth was near. Miss Marple had arranged tonight's gathering at the vicarage, a seemingly innocuous sherry party to discuss the church roof fund, but her true purpose was to confront Mrs. Trent and Lawrence with the clues that had unraveled their alibis. She had invited a small group: Mrs. Bantry, Griselda, and Mr. Clement, Mrs. Baines, and a few villagers to provide a natural setting for her observations. The vicarage drawing room was warm, its fire crackling, its tables laden with crystal, glasses and plates of delicate sandwiches. Griselda, ever the lively hostess, greeted Miss Marple with a hug, her chatter filling the room. Mrs. Trent arrived in a green silk dress, her pearl necklace gleaming but her ears bare, her smile as polished as ever. Lawrence followed, his lean frame tense, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk's. Mrs. Baines, pale and fidgety, clutched her lavender-scented handkerchief, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the other's vibrancy as sherry was poured. Miss Marple steered the conversation to the Colonel's death, her voice gentle but deliberate. "Such a tragedy," she said, her eyes resting on Mrs. Trent, "and so puzzling, with the window open and those papers scattered, almost as if someone was searching for something." Mrs. Trent's glass paused at her lips, and Lawrence's fingers tightened on his own. "Constable Pauck thinks it a burglary," Miss Marple continued, "but I wonder, the letter opener suggests a moment of passion, don't you think?" The room grew quiet, the villagers' murmurs fading. Mrs. Baines's handkerchief twitched, and Miss Marple noted the faint lavender scent wafting from her direction. She turned to Mrs. Trent, her tone as mild as the sherry in her hand. "I found a pearl earring in the cottage garden, and another in Mrs. Baines's kitchen. Such a distinctive design, almost like yours, Mrs. Trent." The widow's smile froze, her fingers brushing her neck where the pearls lay. "I've lost several pairs," she said lightly, but her voice trembled. Lawrence's gaze darted to her, a warning flicker. Miss Marple pressed on, producing the silk scrap from her pocket. "And this, found by my cat, Tiberius, near Willow Cottage. It matches your shawl, Mrs. Trent, and carries the same lavender scent as Mrs. Baines's handkerchief." Mrs. Baines gasped, her hands twisting the cloth, while Mrs. Trent's composure wavered, her eyes narrowing. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but her words cut like a needle through fabric. "Then there's the locket, with a photograph of a young woman remarkably like you. Mrs. Trentan, the initials CTI, understand you were once Clara Harrow, engaged to a soldier, perhaps Colonel Hawthorne, until a scandal parted you." The room was silent now, the villagers' eyes wide. Griselda clutched her husband's arm, and Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her face alight with curiosity. Mrs. Trent's lips parted, but no words came. Lawrence stood, his chair scraping the floor. "This is absurd," he said, his voice sharp. "You've no proof." Miss Marple drew the burned paper fragment from her pocket, its words clear in the firelight. "No forgiveness," it says. And a letter, found in a locked box, opened by a key Tiberius discovered. Demanded the colonel return what was taken. A debt, perhaps, or a secret from your shared past. She turned to Lawrence. "You visited him, Mr. Vale, speaking of old debts and no quarter given. Your sketch of a letter opener, found in the churchyard, suggests you knew the weapon." Lawrence's face paled, his hands clenching. Mrs. Trent rose, her voice trembling with anger. "Enough. I was at Willow Cottage that night, yes, to confront Reginald about his letters. He threatened to expose my past Clara Harrow's past. But he was alive when I left." The admission hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her resolve did not waver. "And you, Mr. Vale, your alibi of sketching by the river has no witness. This handkerchief, with your initials, was found tonight, scented with lavender." She held it up, its embroidery catching the light. Lawrence's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice low. "I followed Celia. I saw her leave, and I went in. He taunted me about her, about the past, about debts I could never repay. I picked up the letter opener. I didn't mean to." His voice broke, and he sank into his chair, his head in his hands. Mrs. Baines, trembling, spoke up. "I saw Mr. Vale leave. Miss I didn't say, for fear of trouble. I cleaned the rug, hid the earring, thinking to protect them." The room erupted in whispers, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm. "Tiberius led me to each clue: the pearls, the silk, the locket, the key, the glove, the handkerchief. They told the story of a past that could not be buried." She looked at Lawrence, her eyes kind but unflinching. "You acted in a moment of rage, Mr. Vale, but the truth cannot be hidden." Constable Polk, summoned by Mr. Clement, arrived as Lawrence confessed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. Mrs. Trent, tears streaming, admitted her part in stirring old wounds, but denied the killing. Mrs. Baines, sobbing, confessed to her silence, born of loyalty to the woman she had served in London years ago. Miss Marple stepped back, her work done, as Pock led Lawrence away. Tiberius, perched on the windowsill, watched with quiet approval, his tail flicking. Once, the villagers dispersed, their whispers filling the night, and Miss Marple walked home, the stars above St. Mary Mead bright and unyielding, like the truth she had uncovered. Chapter 9. The Cat's Testimony. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a quiet clarity, the sky a pale wash of pink and gold that seemed to cleanse the village of its recent shadows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour at Dane Mead Cottage, her knitting resumed at last, the pale blue shawl taking shape under her steady hands. The fire crackled softly, and Tiberius, her tabby cat, lay curled on the hearthrug, his amber eyes half closed in contentment, though Miss Marple knew better than to assume he was idle. The events of the previous evening at the vicarage, the confrontation that had unravelled Lawrence Vale's guilt, Mrs. Celia Trent's tearful admission, and Mrs. Baines's reluctant confession had brought the mystery of Colonel Hawthorne's murder to a close. Yet, as Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind lingered on the delicate threads that had woven the truth, and the pivotal role of Tiberius, whose silent testimony had guided her every step. The village was abuzz with the news of Lawrence's arrest, the whispers carrying from the post office to the tea room, where Mrs. Price held court with renewed vigour, stabbed with a letter opener, and all for a love gone sour. She exclaimed to a rapt audience, her hands gesturing as if wielding the weapon herself. Miss Marple, passing by on her way to the church, smiled faintly but said nothing. The truth, as always, was more complex than the village's gossip, a tapestry of old betrayals and hidden debts, unravelled not by dramatic flourishes, but by quiet observation and the uncanny instincts of a cat dot in the churchyard, where the morning light gilded the gravestones. Miss Marple paused by the Harrow plot, her thoughts on Clara Harrow now revealed. As Mrs. Celia Trenton, the scandal that had shaped her life, the locket with its photograph and lock of dark hair, had confirmed her identity, tying her to the colonel and the artist who had become Lawrence Vale. The pearl earrings, the lavender-scented silk scrap, the glove, the button, the brass key, the handkerchief, and the burned paper fragment had each played their part. But it was Tiberius who had found them, his prowling through gardens and lanes uncovering what human eyes had missed. Miss Marple knelt to place a small posy of asters on Clara's parents' grave, a gesture of respect for a past that had cast long shadows. She walked to the vicarage to thank Griselda for hosting the gathering, finding her friend in the garden, pruning roses with more enthusiasm than skill. "Oh, Jane, you were marvellous," Griselda said, her eyes bright, like something out of one of Raymond's novels, only better. Miss Marple demurred, her smile gentle. "It was Tiberius, really," she said, glancing at the cat, who had leaped onto a garden wall, his tail flicking as if in acknowledgement. Griselda laughed, but Miss Marple was serious. The blood on his paw, the silk scrap, the locket, the key, the button each had been a stepping stone to the truth, placed by a cat who saw what others overlooked. At Willow Cottage, Constable was concluding his investigation, the study now orderly, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple visited to return the brass key which had unlocked the colonel's box and its damning letter. Poke, red-faced with gratitude, admitted he'd have missed the box without her guidance. "And your cat, miss," he added, scratching his head. "Queer how he kept turning up things." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on Tiberius, who was sniffing at a rosebush near the window where the murder had occurred. She recalled the scuff mark on the rug, the open window, and the gardener's sighting of a woman in a green shawl, Mrs. Trent, fleeing after her confrontation with the colonel, followed by Lawrence, whose rage had ended in violence. Mrs. Trent, now staying at Rose Hall, under the watchful eye of the police, had sent a note to Miss Marple, a brief but heartfelt apology. "For her deception, I meant no harm," she wrote, "but my past was a weight I could not shed. Lawrence acted to protect me, though I begged him not to." Miss Marple read the note by her fire, her heart heavy with pity. Clara Harrow's love for the artist had cost her dearly her engagement, her family. Her peace and the colonel's arrival, with his threatening letters, had reignited that pain. Mrs. Baines, too, had written, confessing her loyalty to Clara, whom she had served in London during those scandalous days. Her silence, born of devotion, had nearly obscured the truth. But Tiberius's fines had pierced that veil, that as evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village settle into its familiar rhythm. The church bell tolled, children laughed in the lane, and the postman cycled past, his whistle faint but cheerful. St. Mary Mead was itself again, its surface calm, restored, but Miss Marple knew its depths held countless secrets, waiting for a keen eye or a curious cat to uncover them. She reached down to stroke Tiberius, whose purring filled the quiet room. "You saw it all, didn't you?" she murmured, her fingers tracing his ears. The blood on his paw had marked the crime, the silk scrap had pointed to the shawl, the locket had named Clara, the key had unlocked the letter, the button had confirmed her presence, the glove had placed her at the scene, and the handkerchief had sealed Lawrence's fate. Each clue, small and seemingly trivial, had been a testament to Tiberius's silent vigilance. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, the shawl growing under her hands. The case was closed, Lawrence awaiting trial, Mrs. Trent facing questions, but likely free, and Mrs. Baines returned to her quiet duties. Yet Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had been served. She thought of the Colonel, whose past had caught him at last, and of Clara, whose love had led to ruin. The village, with its tidy gardens and polite smiles, was a stage for human frailty, and Miss Marple, with Tiberius at her side, its patient observer. As the fire died to embers, she set her knitting aside, her eyes on the stars beyond the window, knowing that St. Mary Mead would hold more secrets, and Tiberius would be there to guide her when they surfaced. The end.